I worked on an antitrust case from Mercedes-Benz, and we represented different dealers. I invaded Panama.
You invaded Panama. Wait, back up a second.
And I had been contacted by a fellow. He said, I think I'm getting ripped off by a company called DaVita, which does kidney dialysis.
Hi, this is another episode of American Whistleblower. We're here today. My name is Joe Piacentile. I'm the host, and my guest today is a good friend of mine and a very excellent lawyer who's also in the whistleblower space, but that's one of the many things that he does over the years. Fascinating man. His name is Bob Magnanini, and we're going to explain his name. And we're going to ask him all about that name. And the firm is Stone and Magnanini, and they're in New Jersey, in Central Jersey. And they do more than whistleblower. They do, I'll let Bob explain what they do. And I'm going to call him Bob because I know him for, how many years I know you, Bob?
A long time, Joe, since 04, I think.
04. So what is that, 21 year? 21 years.
Longer than a lot of marriages.
That's a good point. So let's start with your name first, because it's not a common name. Magnanini, is that the proper pronunciation?
Right, or if you're Italian, Magnanini. So yeah, we have the standard, immigrant story in America. Unlike, I guess, the people who they're kicking out. My family came at a time when I guess they were trying to kick them out. But so my mother's family actually came from Scotland, and my great-grandfather worked on battleships for the Royal Navy at Scapa Flow.
Wait, so you're Italian from Scotland or Scottish from Scotland?
My mother's Scottish from Scotland. So when they came over, the ship broke down. So my great-grandfather went down, fixed the propeller, and the captain told him, you're going to have dinner with us tonight. And so he, my grandfather, my uncle, eat with the captain, and the captain says, when we dock in New York, everybody's going to get off at this island, not you three. And so my grandfather says, okay, or great-grandfather, boat docks, everybody gets off. They make it to Manhattan. They go down a long wooden gangplank, and there's a guy waiting at the bottom and says, who are you? And he says, I'm Hawksby. And he goes, good, you're coming with me. And he says, where are we going? He says, Brooklyn. You're going to make battleships for the U.S. Navy at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. So my mother's family came in that way. And my dad's family came, my grandmother's from Modena up north, where the world's best Italian restaurant is around Osteria Francescana, with a guy wrote a book called Never Trust a Skinny Chef. And so, so if you ever get to Modena, you can eat at this.
I went to my cousin's wedding in Italy, and the chef had to weigh 325 pounds if he weighed an ounce. And I was really heavy at the time. And he came out and he saw me. And this is a wedding party. It had to be 200 people. And it went until the next morning. I mean, it didn't stop. But he came out and kept feeding me to see if I liked his food. And I said, you got to stop. I can't eat anymore. I'm going to explode. And he just, from the moment I got there, for about 7 hours straight, he would bring soup. He brought everything, soup, pasta, meat, different kinds of meat. It's just crazy. It's a different culture over there. Right?
Yeah, my wife is actually Scottish and Danish, but she's a wannabe Italian. So when we go there, she's happy. She says, these people, it's la dolce vita. Everybody knows how to live. You enjoy life. And I said, unlike, America, where everybody works to live, there they live. And then you work if you work. It's funny. But my grandfather came from Florence or Firenze. And we don't have any record of him actually coming into the U.S. So I think he got here on a ship, was ill. They quarantined him at.
Who was it that came in on the boat and went down the plank? Who was it, Bobby?
That was my mother's great grandfather. So my mother's family ended up.
They got here.
That was 1923.
He didn't go through Ellis Island? He bypassed it?
No, because he had gotten, the captain had called in and said, I've got somebody.
No, he had a skill. I get it. So he bypassed Ellis Island, which is really rare.
It is. It's
right?
Yeah, and then the Italians came in. My grandmother, records of Ellis Island, I think she came in like 1912 or 14, right before World War I started. And my grandfather, when he came over, we have no records of him coming in. We think they actually wanted to send him back to Italy, and he jumped overboard and swam ashore. And so he was, and so my grandmother had a son already, Gino Lametti, and so he ended up leaving in the Depression and working for the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and helping build like the Grand Canyon Lodge and Yosemite Lodge and those things. And then I guess about 1940, he figured World War II was going to come to America, and he said, I don't want to have to kill Italians. So he joined the Army Air Force, was a bomber pilot, and fought in the Pacific. He got killed in March of.
Who is this?
This is would be my uncle, my father's brother.
Your father's brother died
at the very end of World War II. Yeah, he was in the class like after the Doolittle bombers. So he fought in World War II from 42
So
to 45.
Do you know what year he died? He died in 45?
In March of 45, yeah. So
Wow.
There's a plaque for him and his crew. And so, yeah, my dad used to get 3 nickels, and he would then have a nickel for the subway to go from Greenwich Village up into the Bronx. And then he would have a nickel for lunch and a nickel to come back home. And so I guess he went to high school between 44 and 48. And then he met my mother and at a dude ranch, and he was a photographer's assistant. And she said, why aren't you taking pictures of me? So they began dating. And my mother's family, my grandmother was Catholic, but my grandfather, who was one of 10 kids, was Protestant. So he converted. And so my mother said it was always difficult because I went to Catholic school, and they said, oh, your Protestant relatives are all going to go to hell. And my mom kept saying, but they're such nice people. How could this be? And then, and so she and my dad started dating, and somebody had said something like, Catherine, we don't go for the mixing of the races here. And of course, my mother said,
the races, Catholic and Christian?
Well, but as my mother said, well, we're Catholic, he's Catholic, you all may be Protestant. And so my parents got married my dad was, I guess, my mom got him working at a bank at Manufacturers Hanover back then.
Call it Manihani.
Yeah, which is now part of, I guess, City. And so, and this is funny, Joe, in 1957, I guess, they said, geez, you're pretty smart, and we're going to give you a minority scholarship because you're Italian. And so they gave him a scholarship and paid for NYU. And my dad's still a little bitter because they gave him $5 a credit at NYU was in the late 50s. And I guess he said the last semester in 61, they raised it to $10 a credit.
Your father graduated college?
Yeah. So he went to NYU. He graduated with a degree in economics and accounting because he said I needed to have a skill to pay for things. Ended up he was a stockbroker and a petrochemical analyst in the 70s. And when he retired in, I guess around the end of the 90s, he was the head of investment for PNC Bank. So he ran a couple of $1 billion because he tried to retire, and it took about 2 years to actually extract himself from all these investment groups, committees, people that he dealt with, and all that kind of stuff. So they're retired now. They live down in Nokomis, Florida.
But that's great that your father went to college. I mean, my father never got past the 8th grade. Different background. We do have one thing in common. My uncle was the sole survivor of a B-29 bomber crash in 1945. He had been a bombardier, and in the B-25s, and then they upgraded to the B-29. And then you're a military man. You're going to talk about military.
Yeah.
But you'll appreciate this, and it ties into the whistleblower work that we do. At the end of the war, Boeing came out with the B-29, and the B-29 was designed specifically to fly from South Seas to Tokyo so that they could bomb Japan. We were going to bomb Japan and end the war that way. There was no atom bomb. So we were massing our troops near Japan, and everybody was being transferred to Japan. So the B-29 comes out, and it's much lighter, and it's bigger, and it can hold more bombs and fly a much longer distance. The trouble is, in order to be lighter, they cased the engines in magnesium, because
Right.
magnesium is a very light but strong metal. There's a famous test pilot who was test piloted all the Boeing planes in World War II. He died test piloting the B-29. They took it up. It blew up in midair. The autopsy on that crash was that the magnesium engine casings were the wrong metal to put around an engine.
Right. They get hot.
They get hot. Right. You know that. So they get hot, and they heated the gas lines, which run at the back of the wings are filled. If you look what a B-29 does, right? The wings are filled with gasoline, let's call it.
Fuel. Right. Yeah.
Fuel for the plane. The middle of the plane is just filled with bombs. So
tube, right.
Explosives and gasoline.
And a bunch of guys. 13
engine
people.
and 11 guys, right. And, this is what they did. Nobody appreciates it. So he takes up his brand new B-29 that they just got. He's in the front seat. He's in that bubble in the front. That's where he sat. And all they remember is the plane exploded. Everyone died. He woke up in an army hospital. 2 days later, he had survived. Apparently, the bubble in the front, he got blown one way and the plane landed another. And, he could never talk about it. He died in his late 90s. And he never wanted a ceremony or a service. He wanted to be cremated and his ashes spread over the ocean. So I guess he wanted to
go back with his friends.
Go back with his buddies. Yeah. And it turns out that, so Boeing actually shipped these B-29s, and they had to know. They had to know that because their test pilot died the same way. Right. But, whether it's because we needed these planes to end the war, so they sort of compromised on their safety, or they didn't care. I mean, it's one or the other, right? But it doesn't matter. But he hated, my uncle, to the day he died, the military using private citizens. He said, when we were in World War II, we made $40 a month, and everybody who I worked with, the guy who put the air in the tires of my plane, the guy who washed the plane, the guy who loaded the ammo, the guy who fed me, the guy who cooked for me, they were all active duty. And all we wanted to do is win the war and go home. And they won that war in 3.5 years, right? They defeated the Nazis on one side of the world, the Japanese on another, in 3.5 years. We're 22 years in Afghanistan or some crazy number like that. And the Middle East, these wars never end. They cost billions of dollars. And it's contractors, private contractors making fortunes. And that's
right. Yeah, when I was active duty, we had that. They were in the process of getting, when I went in the Army in '84, at kind of the height of the evil empire and all that, we had cooks. We had people who, they had vets who looked at the cat and said, "Oh, you can eat this, you don't eat that," and they kept trying to get rid of all the support.
Take that back a second. You joined the military when? How old were you? And why did you join the Army? How did you go about? Were you a lawyer and a military guy? So just tell me how you got into those two fields at the same time.
Right. So I went to Fordham in the Bronx, as you well know.
College or for
college?
And I'm a Fordham grad. What year did you graduate?
84.
Ah, okay. I'm older than you. I graduated. Holy moly, 73.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm older than you.
I was there for like Fort Apache in the Bronx. But my parents, after they got married, we lived in the old country of Brooklyn. And then at some point,
we're in Brooklyn,
Sheepshead Bay on Ford Street.
Okay.
Between you and Flatbush.
Okay. That's Brooklyn.
Yeah. So then my mom wanted to move further out on the island to Roslyn. And my dad said, I was born on an island and then I married you and moved to an island. He goes, I want to go to the mainland.
Yeah.
And
right.
so we're going to Jersey. So we ended up in a town called Woodcliff Lake, which is the very north.
Woodcliff Lake? You live in I'm in Woodcliff Lake right now. That's where I'm at right now.
You see all paths. So we moved in 70. And so we moved 1970 from Brooklyn in February. So I was in Catholic school, and then we moved out to Woodcliff Lake. So I went to Dorchester and then Woodcliff School between 70, and I guess I graduated in 8th grade in 1976. And we lived on the other side of the lake from you. So we lived on Oak Street. So if you cross the reservoir, go Broadway, and
The
you
lake.
went up.
Funny you say we live in a lake. I thought it was a
Yeah,
lake too. It's a reservoir. I'll tell you one day.
the reservoir that was dry a lot of times.
A great story about the lake. One day it was, there's that road that goes right over the lake.
The causeway, yeah.
Right. And you have to cross it to go from my house to the train station. And one day, I don't know what happened, but this is a New Jersey story. There were dead birds lying all over the surface of the lake and dead fish that came up from the lake. It looked like a scene from the book of Revelation. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, only in New Jersey could this happen. And nobody asked questions. Like no one said, wait a second, why are all these dead birds lying on the surface like, and all these dead fish? It looked like Armageddon. And like no one even batted an eyelash in New Jersey. They just assumed the toxicity. Yeah, they just assume that toxicity is like, it's fine, That's the one thing about Jersey that always bothered me.
When we were there, we knew some derelict kids, and they used to get M80s. You would take the bus to Chinatown, and you would go and buy various explosives for use for the July things. But we knew these kids, they would put the M80 and tape it to a rock and light fuse and blow on it. So the fuse would burn inside, and they throw it into the lake like a depth charge. And when the M80 exploded, the fish would be stunned and float to the top. So these guys would try and fish that way. So I could see the fish, but the birds would freak me out.
My dad told me a story that he started the war off, crazy enough, in 1942 March. So 3 months after Pearl Harbor, he was already trained and in Alaska, waiting for the Japanese invasion from the Aleutian Islands. And the Japanese planes would fly over his position in Nome, Alaska, but they wouldn't drop bombs. They would just go back. So after a while, they realized that the Japanese are not going to invade. And so they shipped him off 2 years later to the Philippines. And they would go fishing by dropping hand grenades in these little, they're not lakes, what do you call them?
Like the patties in the pond.
In the jungle, there's these little bodies of water filled with fish, and they just drop a hand grenade, and all the fish would float to the top. They grab the fish, and they start eating. It was just, it was the way he went fishing, my father.
Well, it's funny, because I said the war was, that war was different for people. My father had a cousin named Guy Lametti, and Guy, my dad said, he's the lightest person on his feet. He's like Bing Crosby, Fred Astaire, they're just put them together. And so he was a dentist, and I guess graduated dental school in 1941, did whatever minimal training. And after Pearl Harbor, they drafted him, said, we need dentists, and they shipped him to Hawaii, to Pearl Harbor. So he went there and he worked on all the survivors of the attack and things like that. And he meets my Aunt Norma, who was a nurse, and the two of them become the ballroom dancing champions of the Pacific Theater. So he spends World War II, right? There's all this horror and death, and he's going around with Bob Hope and the Andrews sisters dancing through the
wow. Okay, he hooked up with them.
And then he would go back to Hawaii and do some dental work. And he said he was fairly sad when the war ended.
You know who the first performer was that went to entertain the troops?
Marlene Dietrich or
Al Jolson.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, my dad told me stories that he saw Al Jolson when he was in the service. Crazy, right? It was just.
Well, that's the other side of World War II.
Bobby, so tell me about going to law school and getting in the Army. Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, so I was
what happened first?
Well, first was the Army. I was at Fordham in the early 80s, and I became interested in the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. And so I was interested in that because in 79, the U.S. ambassador was a guy named Adolph Dubs who had been killed. And so there was all sorts of talk of doing this. And in the high school I went to, Pascack Hills.
Who's your ambassador was named Adolph? The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations?
Yeah, no, to Afghanistan was named Adolph Dubs.
Adolph. You would think that, I don't know.
Right. Nobody would name their kid that, right? That was a name that was stricken from the baby list.
Yeah,
but
right. That's off the top 10.
Yeah, not anymore. But yeah, so he ended up getting killed, and I became interested, and so I was at Fordham, and I was a classics major, a history major, a this or that, and I became a Soviet studies major. And so in 1983, they had William Casey, who was the head of the CIA
Yeah.
under Reagan.
Isn't
And
he the one? Isn't he the one who died fishing under Reagan? Bob Casey. Yeah. Didn't he die while he was fishing on a lake, and then they blamed everything on him?
No, I think I don't know if it was the same Casey. This guy was the CIA head, and I thought he ended up retiring.
He did. Well, he did retire. I think what happened with him, I'm going to check it, but I really believe that he had died fishing on a lake, and then they blamed all of that Reagan. What was the name of the scandal? The Iran-Contra scandal. So every time something came out, they just blamed it on the dead guy.
Convenient. It wasn't me. It was that guy over there.
Well, that was the funny part. Every time something new came out, they just blamed it on this dead CIA director, like he was the only one
who knew everything. Yeah, so he gave a speech at Fordham, and they had me meet him because there were two Soviet studies guys, me and a friend of mine, Tracy Tack, and it was a Czech guy. And so I went down and interviewed, and so they were like, if you come work at the agency, we'll shut up your record. And I had been going to class kind of intermittently, and so junior year came, I was working at a 7-Eleven, and I would work night shift, so I would read all the books and stuff like that, and it was great. I was the arbiter of what was pornography and what was not for Montvale, New Jersey. And so because they would send us these things, and if it horrified me, I wouldn't sell it, but of course nothing really horrified me, so they sold everything. And so I'd stopped going to class, and the dean called my dad on Pearl Harbor Day. I remember December 7th, and said, he's got a scholarship here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Bob Casey died of pneumonia. William Colby was a CIA director who died mysteriously. He was on his canoe, and he died near his Maryland home. And it was Colby that they blamed everything on. So there's a conspiracy that he was murdered.
You're right. We need somebody to take the heat. You've had a good life,
Well, correct. Well, that's what they do. You blame the dead guy, right?
Yeah. Remember,
when I was, I had pled guilty to a felony 30 years ago, right? And that's how I started my career of whistleblowing. But then I was in a halfway house. That was my sentence. And I would do investigations while I'm in the halfway house. So I'm sitting in a room with a bunch of U.S. attorneys and FBI agents, and I'm going over the transcripts of an investigation that I had done because I wore wires, right? So I'm sitting there, and I was still in the halfway house, but I had permission to go. I wasn't supposed to leave Manhattan. And I'm showing them tapes of an investigation I did, and I think it was in southern Jersey or something like that. And then right in the middle of looking at these investigations, this woman, a U.S. attorney from like an Ivy League background, and she saw me. She saw the devil, right? Because she was a nice lady, but she was just one of these people that didn't. Yeah. So she stops in the room, and all the rest of the room, bunch of Irish guys, FBI agents, but this woman was like. So she just stops and she says, "Wait a second. It says here that you were in New Jersey on such and such a date at such and such a time." I go, "Yeah." She says, "But weren't you supposed to be in the halfway house? Didn't you violate the terms of your thing by being there?" And I said, and I stopped for a second, and all these guys are looking at me. Now, all they care about is the case. They don't care. The FBI agents don't really care where I was at what time, right? So I just thought for a second. I said, "I have permission." And she got her pen out. And she says, "What? You got permission from who?" And she starts writing, right? Mr. Andre Pabon. That was his name, I think. Andre Pabon. She says, "Pabon? How you spell that?" I said, Pabon. And she said, "Well, I'm going to contact Mr. Pabon, and I'm going to see if he gave you the permission." I said, "Mr. Pabon's dead. He died." And she goes, "What?" I says, "He's dead." And all the FBI agents start laughing. The U.S. attorneys start laughing. She said, "It's not funny." She said, "He wasn't supposed to be. How are you sure? Can you prove that Mr. Barbone?" No, I said it was a conversation. He just told me I could go, but he gave me authority. He had the authority. He told me I could leave. And you sure he's dead? I said, "Oh, he's dead." Yeah, they were just. And then one of the FBI agents, he bailed me out. He said, "Can we move on? Can we move past this?
I've actually got a question for you.
Like, can we get on with the story?" The guy's got all this information about a case. She was livid. She hated me. I forget her name, Bobby, but she was like, just you could see the look on her face. She knew I was lying. She knew. But he may have given me, I don't know. I don't remember. It was so it's a non-consequential thing. He may have given me permission, but he definitely was dead. So, whenever you get caught with your pants down, just blame the dead guy.
Well, it's funny. I was lucky because they had asked if I had wanted to go work for them at the CIA as a Soviet analyst, but there were all sorts of restrictions where you could live, what you could do. And I said, I had joined ROTC because I had been kind of derelict in going to school. And I ended up having to do my entire semester in 3 weeks in December. So I took the first quarter test. I took the midterms. I took third quarter test. I wrote papers. I did that. And I got like a 3.8 GPA. There was a professor on Dostoevsky who refused. He said, "Because you never came to class, I'll give you a B instead of an A." And, so I joined ROTC to stay interested. And given the option with the CIA or the Army, I went in the Army. I said, I'll rather go shoot people and than, be told where to live and where to travel and things like that. So
I would have rather been in the CIA if I had that choice. But that's, I like the clandestine stuff. I just do.
Well, it would have been interesting, but I think I would have been, a desk guy. It sounded like. So I figured I'll take the Army.
You don't strike me as the James Bond type.
Well, of course, what happened was I show up and the Army, and they're like, "Oh, we're going to make you a field artillery guy." And
oh my God, you're going to go deaf in 3 weeks.
That's what I said. I said, I'll blow stuff up and become deaf. And I said, I'm like ranked second out of 100 ROTC students at Fordham.
You should go into intelligence. Yeah.
I should get to do what I want, lead people around. And I wrote a letter and I said, I'm a Soviet studies history double major, blah, 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 and all this stuff. And then they said, all right, we're going to make you military intelligence.
There you go.
That's the oxymoron you're trying
to avoid. More military intelligence. No, but it's good.
Yeah. Yeah, right. So I ended up getting transferred to Arizona to Fort Huachuca. As I tell the story, the wife never likes it. There's no romance in it, she said, but I called the sergeant who at the end of the conversation says to me, "Sir, there's no women here, so bring your own or do without." And I said, that's the impetus I need to marry that girl. So we got married. I graduated. I guess I got commissioned in the Army May 19th. I graduated Fordham May 20th. I moved out in New York May 22nd. I moved her stuff May 23rd. We got the marriage license the 24th. We did a rehearsal the 25th. We got married the 26th. We went on a honeymoon, came back, and then drove across country to Arizona. So I was active duty from May of 84 to September of 90. So I was out at...
So you're active duty, and then at what point you go to law school?
That was it. I was at Fort Ord, and I guess I'd been deployed about 4 of the 6 years.
Fort Ord
in Monterey, California.
Nice. Monterey, California.
Live in Joe. It's a place where other people go on vacation.
Yeah,
all of our family kept coming on vacation, so all of our vacation was spent taking our families around. And then my wife's parents actually moved out and lived in Carmel.
Nice. The beautiful of America, yeah.
And so we lived well. I was just deployed a lot. I was in South America. I was in the Mideast as a counter-terrorist guy. I did counter-drug work in South America. I debriefed Tom Clancy for clear and present danger, which is what we used to do. And then, and it was very funny because I told him at the end, I said,
Tom Clancy?
Yeah, I spent a week with Mr. Clancy. We took him out. We showed him how we did patrolling, how this or that. And he remember him looking, and we had a little box called a PPS-15. It was a little ground surveillance radar, and it kind of turned and would tell you if a vehicle or a person was coming. And he looks at this thing on like these little wooden poles, and he goes, I can't believe the president of the United States sends you into harm's way with this. And I said, well, I said, I know you've been on submarines and aircraft carriers. There's a lot more money spent. I said, we're cheap to move and cheap to bury. So I said,
Oh, it's cheap to bury. Wow.
we don't get a lot of stuff. But I told Clancy, I said, the one thing I learned from your books is, had I been smart enough and gone in the Navy, I said, I was a lieutenant, but I did the job of a major. And I said, they would have breveted me a major, had pinned it on, and I would have got paid. I said, but in the Army, they screw you. I was just a lieutenant. And so at the end of this week with the military, there were all these generals, and Clancy got up and he thanked everybody and came over and shook my hand. And he said, you should be a major. And so, and all these generals were looking at him, said, what's that? And I said, oh, yeah. I said, hey, I should have been in the Navy. But anyway, I did the Army. I invaded Panama. I did all these jobs in the Mideast and South America.
When you invaded Panama, wait, back up a second. Like you invaded Panama. You went to Panama?
Yeah, so I was, Operation Just Cause. And when I was first in Panama, we flew down, I think I went December 19th. And there was a whole series of problems.
So you weren't in law school yet. You were active duty, and that was your
active duty. So I think, Joe, at some point, because I was doing these drug jobs and terrorism.
No, in Panama, we fought Cubans, right?
And so they're right. There were a bunch of Cubans we scooped up and had to ship back to Fidel. Yeah.
Cute story. I don't know how cute it is, but I had a client, and he was Cuban, but he was in naval intelligence. Like you said, should have gone to the Navy. And he was assigned to the White House, and it was one of the Bushes, I think the dad, who was the father, right, at the time. And he was the real deal. And one night we're sitting at a bar, a restaurant, and he's getting just hammered. And he was in the healthcare, he in business now, and he was blowing the whistle on some healthcare thing. But the more important, he was a Cuban national, American citizen at this point, and he was the naval intelligence officer for the White House. So he would tell me these stories. So as he's going on, and he's the more he's drinking, the more he's talking, right? And then he's saying he would be the one to go on the submarines and land Navy. The Navy SEALs would take him in, and he would go into Cuba as an agent, and he would go and get information, and then he'd go back to the beach, and they'd pick him up again, the Navy SEAls, and do it back out. Yeah, a lockout. He was in Cuba like 30 times, but never once went to the airport. He always went in by submarine. And when Panama happened, apparently what we did is we would drop in I don't know what he was. He wasn't a Navy SEAL, but he was a Cuban intelligence officer. But they went in ahead of the land invasion, and they would take these satellite dishes that were pointed to Soviet satellites and kill the 3 people who were in the jungle maintaining the satellite, and then reposition these discs so the American satellite system would use them.
Yeah, so we could pick up. Yeah, we had a lot of Soviet trawlers would come by after and got rid of Noriega.
So he's telling me these stories, Bobby, and then he said, he hated Cubans, right? Because they were communists. So I killed him with my knife, he said, and I took the patch off his arm, the Cuban military patch, and I put it on the knife, and I left it, and I stuck it up his butt. And I left his dead body for them to find after we repositioned satellites. He's telling me these stories. And he said, I got shot, he said. And then he lifts up his shirt, Bobby, and there's a bullet wound. And then he says, and then when we were leaving, after we had the invasion, we were leaving in the plane, and they were shooting at us again, and I got shot in the back. And then he pulls up another wound. He shows me another wound. This guy's he's peppering his stories with his knife wounds and wounds that he sustained. But I'm a doctor, so like when he pulls up his shirt and tells me that he got sliced in the shoulder, there's the wound, and the bullet holes. This guy had every wound to match these crazy stories. But when guys like that tell you what happened in that invasion, it's really fascinating. There's guys who wore uniforms and guys who didn't, right?
Yeah, well, because I was in contact with the special ops people and things like that, because I briefed the invasion when they took off, and then we landed in Of course, it's the government. So we land in Kelly Air Force Base in Texas, and it's like 30 degrees. And we're in jungle fatigues. Everybody's ready for the hunt. So everybody comes out. Now we're all freezing. So I would get all this classified intelligence, and I was the declassification authority, so I had authority to I could brief you on the intelligence, but not the sources. So I told people, this is what happening. There's attacks at a Ryan tank farm. Were securing a canal. The SEALs are here. Special forces.
So you were briefing the people. Your job was to brief the special forces.
Right. As the flights left Monterey and we flew to Texas. Then we flew from Texas to Panama. So we landed at Panama, and then I was out all over the place. We got shot at by a couple of things, and there was a AC-130 Spectre, a gunship, and this thing had this amazing technology on it, and they shot over our heads into a building, and the people shooting at us had stopped. And when we went in there, the guy in the gunship is circling.
That's a Lockheed airplane, and it's
a C-130 they
cannon. It's like a Gatling gun, right?
Gatling guns on one side, and it actually has a 105 howitzer in the front, which if you ever see it, when it fires, the whole plane actually goes backwards. And it keeps going. But this thing could put
hell in the sky. And the angel of death, the AC-30 is called AC-130. It's a Lockheed. It's called the Spectre, AC-130 Spectre.
Yeah.
And they call it the angel of death or hell in the sky.
Well, that's what they could put. One 20-millimeter bullet, which the head of it is about this big, and it was high explosive white phosphorus. So it would hit, explode, burn you. And it could put one round in every square centimeter of a football field. They said the computers on it were such. It was very interesting, Joe. I briefed at the White House. I did all this kind of stuff. I briefed all these different military commanders. I briefed the Vice President of the United States. The
White Phosphorus. There's a movie. It's called Willie Pete.
Willie Pete, yeah, WP, right.
And there's what's his face? Brad Pitt made a movie about tank battles in World War II.
Yeah.
What's the name of that movie? It's my favorite movie, war movie. What's the name of it? There's a scene in
one
it.
Word. Shia LaBeouf was in it. I remember they killing all my German friend.
Movie Fury. Great movie. Yeah. There's a scene in that movie where the 2 or 3 tanks go into a town in Germany, and they're shooting at it. They're shooting at him from a storefront, a building. And he says, put a couple of rounds of Willie Pete in there. And they shoot 2 rounds. And in this scene, the Germans come out they're fully ablaze. They're on fire and they're screaming. And one guy was going to pick up his rifle and shoot. And he says, nah. One guy says, nah, let him burn. And then the storyline is really, it's a coming of age story about this kid who's working in the tank, that he knows nothing. He was a reporter, but they made him a gunner in a tank. And so he didn't want to kill people. He didn't want to kill anybody. He's in war. So what he did, the first 7 people he kills are these 7 Germans who are on fire. And he machine guns them to death. And it's really an act of kindness.
Yeah, mercy. Yeah, mercy at that point.
Mercy. It's a mercy act because they were on fire, burning from Willie Pete that we shot in there. And you're telling me, and we still use it, these white phosphorus gun shells.
Yeah, we used to have white phosphorus hand grenades you carried in case you had to get rid of like a bunch of files or something, Joe. You'd put it on top of the file cabinet, pop it, walk away, and it would
just burn.
It burns through and incinerates everything. So that's how you get rid of things. You get rid of shot down helicopters. They tried that after
get rid of files, but it's also good if you shoot it into a little crowd of people shooting at you, and it explodes and goes everywhere, and it sticks in your skin, and it goes right into your skin and just burns.
Yeah, you can't get it off. Yeah, it's a great deterrent. It's psychologically terrifying. So I was in Panama for the invasion, and when I first had to brief the Southcom commander, a guy named Max Thurman, who was a 4-star general, I said, I'm Captain Bob Magnanini, sir. I said,
So you're a captain at this point.
Captain, yeah. So I'd been in the Army for 5 years at that point. So I said, I said, why are we here? Just cause Bush said so, because the operation was called Just Cause. And everybody laughed. And General Thurman says,
It
he
wasn't
goes,
because it was a just cause. It was because
it was just cause Bush
Bush
said
said
so.
so.
Yeah, that's right.
That was the joke.
So,
All right.
so everybody laughs. And General Thurman says, he goes, very funny, Captain. He goes, if I see that in the press, you're a dead man. And I said, it shall not cross my lips again, sir. So anyway, I did all these briefings, and I would go out and ended up in a bunch of different firefights. And eventually I would come back and my uniform would be just soaked in other people's blood. And so I would come back in, I'd brief people, and I'd go, and they said, sir, we can't clean this. So they would take my uniforms and burn them. And eventually I had uniforms with nothing on them, Joe, because you used to have your rank on one side and your branch here, and it would say your name and U.S. Army and badges. And I just had nothing. All my uniforms had to be burned. But when I would go to different places in Panama, because I knew the order of the battle, who the commanders were, and as different people came out of hiding, they'd show up and we would scoop them up. And somebody said, you were the most terrifying person in Panama, because you'd walk into a room, and if there was no majors or above, everybody would stop talking and stand to salute you as a captain. And then you had no rank, you had nothing on, and you would point at these different people and they take them away. And so I was responsible for scooping up these different
Don't you
people.
have to wear your rank on your uniform when you're working?
Yeah, on your collar here. As I worked for a guy, John Howard said, he goes, one thing I like about the Army, he goes, we wear visible manifestations of our social position on our collar. So he said, you always know where you stand. And it made things easy. I said, if you were a captain or a lieutenant, I called you by your first name. If you were a sergeant, you were sergeant last name. If you were a private or a corporal specialist, I just called you your last name. And everybody above me was sir or ma'am. And so it made life simple,
It's sort of
So
like the mafia, because they had the organization and had ways of addressing each other. They would
yeah.
say, friend of ours, friend of his. It was interesting. Very similar.
Well, I was the ground commander at the World Trade Center, and I went down to see the New York City police, and I walk in, and I'm a major, and everybody's like, hello, sir. And I'm talking to all these guys with 3 stars who would be generals to me. So I keep saying, hello, sir. Hello. And I said, this is like one of those movies, doctor. So I finally said, what am I in your world? I said, what's this rank? And they said, you're a DI, a deputy inspector. I said, okay. I said, in my world, all of you are generals, so you all outrank me. And I said, we're here, it's ThreatCon Charlie. I said,
So what was your job at the World Trade Center?
I was the Army ground commander, basically.
What does that mean, Bobby? What does that
I
mean?
was the senior staff guy from the National Guard Division. So after the planes hit and the buildings came down, I got a call from Governor Pataki's office through the Army to go into New York City, figure out what's going on, and come up to brief the governor. So I drove in. I was the only car on the
when the plane hit, everything was shut down. Nobody could get in and out, but except military people,
except me, right?
first responders. So you went in representing the military.
Right. Went home. I was actually at work at Latham and Watkins in the Seton Hall Law School building, Joe. And I told people, I said, what's bad?
When did you become a lawyer, Bob?
So okay, so yeah, so I
said you worked at Latham Watkins, where you just jumped from being
I jumped from being a
military guy. So tell us how you got to.
So I guess after Panama,
how'd you make the jump from active duty military intelligence to law?
So in 1988, I was looking at going to law school. A friend of mine was an electrical engineer, and he had gotten IBM paid for him to get a PhD. And he said, he ended up as a patent lawyer down in Virginia. But he said, he had called me and said, if anybody should be a lawyer, it's you. He goes, it's listening to people, understanding problems, and then solving them. And he said, that's what you're good at. And he said, you do it with a flair. So I looked at law school, and my wife actually hand typed my applications. And so I think in 1988, I was down in Guatemala on a mission, and I came back and I had bought the LSE test from the couple of prior versions. And the Sunday I sat
There's
down
a
and did.
lot of military in Guatemala. I never realized.
Yeah, well,
For
it was kind of a
some
staging.
reason, what's the American military presence there?
Well, we were there to do some counter drug terrorism stuff, and
But
then
there's a base there, right?
there were different smaller bases. There's a lot more in Honduras. There's Tegucigalpa, the Goose they used to call it, and Sotocano and different places like that. Guatemala was kind of a smaller in the 80s. El Salvador had a civil war going on. So we were limited in what we could do there. The Costa Ricans, had gotten rid of their military in the 50s under Arias, and he said, "Well, if there's trouble, I need the Americans will come help me." And Panama was veering, into chaos with Noriega. So all those things were happening. But I came back. I took the LSATs at the Monterey School of Law and Hamburger Flipping, I called it. It was an unlicensed, unaccredited ABA law school. And so I'm good at standardized tests. I can eliminate.
So that's where you took your LSATs, which is the entrance exams.
Right. And so I got a 48 out of 48 on
That's
that.
the law school admission test. Just so people know.
So I got what was a perfect score.
Wow.
I think I got 115 right out of 119 questions. So I got a scholarship to the Monterey School of Law. And then I said, well, this is a pretty good score. I'm going to apply to the top law schools. And so my wife and I had to write for the applications. They had to mail them to you. You had to type them out. So my wife's typing them out. And then she looks at the one for UVA and she says, you had to send this in by the middle of January. It's now the middle of February. I said, all right. I said, we'll apply to the top 8 law schools. And so then we were watching some football in Chicago and it was snowing like the end of the world. So I looked at that application. I said, we'll apply to the top 7 law schools. So I ended up getting into Columbia and getting a scholarship that the dean of admissions had been a captain in the army in Vietnam. And so he took a liking to me and I put in
Columbia Law School.
Columbia Law School. Yeah.
Manhattan.
In Manhattan, yeah. So we left
Smart
California in 1990, drove across country. We had one kid at that point, and then I started law school and had a second kid in law school just to make things more difficult on myself. I had to have my shoulder operated on an AC joint resection because I had a building fall on me in Panama. I had a motorcycle crash. I had holes all over me. So I had those things, and we finished law school in 93. And then I went to work at a place called Archer and Griner, which is down in South Jersey. And so I worked there as a litigator and did a lot of environmental stuff. And then I guess in 96, they had given me like a $1,500 raise my first year. And I got a bonus, I think, of $1,500. And I got the only bonus. And then I found out I had worked about 400 hours more than anybody at the firm. So I ended up, I then had a bunch of headhunters going after me because I used to, in the kind of localized small geography of New Jersey, Joe, people are like, well, he's from the north because I came from Bergen County. So I started handling cases from Trenton up. And I had cases in Warren, in like Hunterdon, in every county. And then I would go down south too, to Vineland, to Salem, Cape May, and do all these different cases. So I was working all over the state. And then I got recruited for a job offer from Pitney Hardin in Morristown. And so, and then they were offering me about, I think, 15 grand more at that point. And then somebody else came and I think somebody at Lowenstein Sandler called me, and I interviewed with a guy who used to run the firm called Mike Rodberg, and he was an environmental guy. So he's like, I'd like you to come and work with me, da 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 da. And so they were going to pay me like 20 grand more than Pitney Hardin. So then the headhunters, who were as we used to say, the white slavers, trying to get you and sell you off to whoever they could, came to me and said, Mike Chertoff just left the government and is setting up an office in Newark. We'd like you to interview with him. So I went and met Mike, interviewed, told some Army stories. He had a top secret clearance. and we hit it off, and I got hired by Latham. So I ended up living in South Jersey in Marlton, but working in Newark. So it was a
That was
90-mile.
Latham Watkins. So what were you doing there? You went to
So
Columbia Law School, then you went to Latham Watkins. So what were you doing there, Bob?
I was a litigation associate, and then I was a counsel. So I ended up doing both all the administrative stuff. I ran like the paralegal program, the helping people get promoted to partner. I was the only non-equity partner on the finance committee. So I collected money, I paid bonuses, I did billings, because Mike Chertoff loved work, but not so much administrative stuff. And then Mike ended up leaving after Bush was elected, and he became the head of the criminal division of the Department of Justice. So I stayed at Latham and was handling all these cases that were still there. And then
So what type of cases were you working on?
I did a lot of environmental work still at that time. There were a lot of cases in New Jersey, and Latham, Chicago, or Latham, DC had cases. So I would handle these Superfund sites and things like that. And then somebody said, well, Magnanini figured out CERCLA. He could figure out ERISA. So I did some of that work. And then with Mike Chertoff, we used to do a lot of RICO cases, Joe, big organized crime fraud cases. So we did a big, huge scam on Food Town stores. We did a big mortgage case.
Wait, so at this point, you're working as a private lawyer, or you're working with the U.S. attorney? Mike was
the U.S. attorney, but he was then the managing partner of Latham's New Jersey office.
He was U.S. attorney.
Right. And so when he left being the U.S. attorney, so he was a U.S. attorney under the first Bush. And then when Clinton got elected, Clinton asked him to stay on. So Mike stayed for another 2 years, and maybe a couple of years.
He was the Secretary of Homeland Security.
Right. Mike, afterwards. Yeah. So,
but he was in New Jersey.
Right. Mike grew up in Elizabeth. Yeah. His dad was a rabbi in Elizabeth, and then went to Harvard Law School. His wife, Merrill, was a girl from the Bronx, actually. And so they got married, ended up, I think he clerked for William Brennan on the Supreme Court, and then worked at Latham in D.C., and then he ended up going back. Like I said, he got this job as under the second Bush as the chairman, or as the chief of the criminal division of DOJ. So he moved down to D.C., and then I was at Latham, and then there were a whole bunch of internecine battles at Latham, and so I ended up leaving and going to Boies Schiller.
Okay.
So David Boies.
So you're a lawyer. You were working Latham Watkins. Now, did you leave the military at that point, Bob?
So, well, I left active duty September of '90, and I started law school. And then after a year in law school, I didn't have enough money to feed the wife and kids, so I joined the National Guard in New York. And so I was in the New York National Guard, and I showed up. I had a combat patch.
So you quit active duty, and then you went into the U.S. National Guard in New Jersey or New York?
In New York.
So
I was at Columbia. And actually, I went to this unit, Joe, at the Park Avenue Armory, the beautiful big Tiffany Armory on Park Avenue. Well, the guy who was the the staff officer in charge of personnel, was named Bob Rodriguez. So I walked in, and he looks at my resume, and he goes, "Oh, you went to Fordham?" And I said, "I did." He goes, "So did I." And he said, "You were in the Pershing Rifles military fraternity?" I said, "I was." He goes, "So was I." And he goes, "You don't remember my name? I was a company commander and used to have to memorize all this stuff." And then I said, "What did you do after that?" He said, "Well, I was active duty, and now I went to Columbia Law School, and now I'm working as a lawyer." And I said, "Funny, I'm going to Columbia Law School." So the two of us hit it off, and I joined the National Guard, and I was involved in different things. When there were big storms, we would go rescue people on Fire Island. We would, do.
But how did you manage being a lawyer and that's a lot of work?
Well,
I mean,
I don't sleep a lot, or I didn't sleep a lot. I sleep more now, but I would handle. So I was doing the National Guard while I was at law school, and then I ended up going down to Archer and Reiner, which was down in Haddonfield, and then they assigned me to the 69th Infantry, which were the old Irish unit that leads the St. Patrick's Day parade. So I would have to commute for the Army on the weekend. I drive up to New York City from down by Philadelphia, and I would stay over, and then I'd go back home. And then for, I think, about 8 months, I went to a school at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. So that was easier on me. And then I got promoted to major and had to go to Albany. And then that was a long drive because that was about 4 hours from South Jersey up to Albany. And then I ended up starting to work at Latham. And so we moved up into Central Jersey, Westfield, and that cut the commute to 2.5 hours. So I ended up getting promoted to major and lieutenant colonel, then colonel. And so when I retired, I was the intelligence and security officer and counterterrorist guy for the state of New York for the
All right.
whole.
So this tremendous background in this military intelligence, and then you move over to the National Guard. Now, when do you come to Boies Schiller? You worked at Boies Schiller Flexner, which is a major firm.
Right. So I was at Latham from 97, I think, to 2004. And then, so David Stone, who was running the Jersey office of Boies Schiller, he and I worked on an antitrust case from Mercedes-Benz, and we represented different dealers. And so we started talking about things, and like I said, Chertoff left. Latham had some internecine warfare going on. There was a lot of fighting within the office about different things. They didn't like how New Jersey was being run. They put in a different partner from California. There were all sorts of things going on. So I ended up between meeting Stone and then a friend of mine, Ricardo Singleton, was David Boies' advance man. And Ricardo and I gone to ROTC at Fordham together. We had driven down to camp at Fort Bragg, like driving Miss Daisy before the movie came out. And so Ricardo was talking to me about Schiller. So I went and interviewed and then got the job offer there. So I guess it was February of 2004, Joe. I went to work at Boies Schiller, and I had tangentially been contacted by a fellow at Latham and Watkins who ran one of the FEBAs, the Federal Employee Health Benefit Plans, and he ran the Postmaster's plan, and he had contacted us. I talked to him, and he said, I think I'm getting ripped off by a company called DaVita, which does kidney dialysis. And
I know them really well.
Right. So he explains what's going on. And I said, this does sound bad. So I said, there's this thing called the False Claims Act that you could file suit and, on behalf of the government. And
Wait, so you have a whistleblower who is blowing the whistle. He wants to come to you and blow a whistle on the DaVita Corporation. And you were working at Boies Schiller at that time, or you were working at Latham and Watkins?
At that point, I was still at Latham and Watkins. And so, and the other part of his complaint involved a big hospital chain. And so I talked to the guy who was running the New Jersey office, and I said, this is what it appears to be. But I said, it might be that we represent these entities. So I said, I'm going to do a conflict check. And this guy was like, okay, great. You do it. They'll yell at you. And within like 3 minutes, I get a call from a partner in LA screaming, what are you, stupid? We represent this entity, blah, blah, blah.
They represent DaVita Healthcare?
No, I think the hospital chain.
Oh,
so I said, well, this guy came to me. I said, I ran the conflict check. We'll outsource. So we sent it to somebody. I can't even remember who at this point, but it ended up being a pretty big case. And so when I went to Boies Schiller to do litigation there, Stone was doing it. So like I said, because I think you had met David at that point in 2004. And so then we started doing this work. And I said, I like this. I said, you get to wear the white hat. You're helping the government. All the taxpayers out there, people like us, pay this money. And these clowns are just stealing it from us. And they're screwing people over. They're harming people.
So tell me the case. Did you file a case?
No, so we didn't. So that case, I ended up, we sent it out. And like I said, I can't even remember who we sent it to. And so then I left Latham, went to Boies Schiller, and of course very funny. When I was leaving Latham, the managing partner came in and said to me, he goes, I just was looking at what you've done. He goes, you're working on like 50 different cases. You can't go. And I said, well, I said, I'm going. I said, I've written the memos. I've talked to everybody. I've connected.
So then who
people.
did you go to, Bob? Who did you?
I went to Boies Schiller at that point.
And so how long were you at? Because I want to get to Stone and Magnanini, because that's where you founded your firm.
Boies Schiller, I was there from February of 2004, and we spun off in March of 2009.
So when did Stone and Magnanini start?
So that was March of 2009. So
okay.
we were at Boies, and they were going to do a big pharmaceutical case, but the pharma companies were unhappy that we had previously Bristol Myers, a bunch of people. So they said they would like to hire Boies Schiller, but they wanted them to get rid of the QTAM, the FCA cases. And so David Boies said, you guys can either keep cases and go, and we'll keep working with you, or you get rid of the case and stay. So
I just want to explain that for people. You said FCA and you said QTAM, just so people understand. I don't want to, this is a big point of contention for me, Bobby, but in Latin, it's QTAM. QTAM. People always say QTAM, it drives me crazy. There's words that people say that, there's a few words that just people, it's QTAM. It's from the Latin, he who sues on behalf of the king.
Right.
And it's based on an 1864 law that Abraham Lincoln signed.
Yeah, from Lincoln side, right.
In 1864, Abraham Lincoln created, he signed a law where people could sue on behalf of the U.S. government if the U.S. government is being ripped off. And it started with military cases, right? So
correct. The Union Army uniforms that were made by a company, interestingly enough, called Shoddy.
Shoddy. That's why they get the term shoddy work, because they made uniforms, they glued them together. And then the story goes that the first rain came and all these uniforms fell apart.
So everybody's marching through Virginia in their underwear. Yeah.
And then you said FCA, which really stands for False Claims Act. So it's just called, it's the QTAM Act or the False Claims Act, and it's been expanded over the years. And now it started out with just fraud on the federal government. Then the states, a lot of states enacted, what is it, up to 27 states?
I think 32, I think it's
32 now. Yeah. So the states have a False Claims Act. And then it expanded, right. Then the whistleblower concept expanded, and it went into the IRS has a whistleblower program. The SEC has a whistleblower program. The CFTC, don't even ask me, that has a whistleblower program.
Whether there's anybody there to do it, I don't know. But
yeah, and what happens, and then there was actually a Foreign Corrupt Practice Act case, and actually I had a client in the Ericsson settlement. Ericsson puts up cell towers, and that thing settled. It was like $1.2 billion or something like that to settle.
$1.06 billion settlement.
Yeah. And your partner and I, your firm and I had a client in that case. And, the interesting thing is that now, Donald Trump has now, and I'm not political at all, but he actually stopped the enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act. I think it's because, and he didn't say why, but in other words, one of his presidential orders was that the Department of Justice is not supposed to enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act anymore. And I think it's because he sees it as anti-competitive, meaning our oil and gas companies and our military manufacturers and people like that, they're going out the world trying to set up, trying to do business. And the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act says that if you're a company and you bribe a foreign official to get business, which is the way of the world apparently, and you have any interest in the U.S. stock market, or you raised money from investors, that you could be fined here in the United States, even if the misconduct had nothing to do with the U.S.
Right. So, it happened in the Philippines or something.
Right.
Like
so you can have a company, and some of the cases were like, I think Rolls-Royce settled the case, and because they were setting up, dealerships, and they had to pay people The Ericsson case had to do with bribes of foreign officials to put up cell towers.
Right, and sell their phones.
But, stopping the enforcement of it is because in order for the American economy to do business on a fair, on an even trading floor.
Yeah, an even field.
We have to be able apparently to bribe foreign officials. So, and that's
transactional view of the world. And I know we were all kind of stunned when
I see it, but I love Donald Trump. I do, and I just think he's great. And I think what's doing for the country is. I mean, I'm not political, but I like this. I'm an evangelical Christian, so what can I do? I'm not gonna.
You're not gonna go against them. Well, I was worried because
we have our faith, and our faith tells us. I can't. If you're telling me that your party is based on on castrating little boys who think they want to be girls at the age of 9, and you think that's okay to do, you lost my vote, period. And these crazy things that they're doing, we don't support. So, but anyway, so in the whistleblower world, it got a little smaller because the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act was something that I was involved in, and I was involved in this, you were involved in this $1 billion case, and now we can't do them anymore, which is okay. That's the way of the world, but we can still do false claims cases, false claims. So if you have information with the U.S. government or the state of New York, even for taxes, if somebody's not paying taxes to the state of New York, you can collect under the False Claims Act.
Right. You have to have a lawyer, you can file it yourself, but then you can get, if the government takes over your case, you can get between 15 and 25%. And, like Ericsson, I think the payment from the SEC was to the relator was $279 million.
Yeah. No,
yeah. That was a retirement case. And so we're still working. And I said, and, some of the cases we had done with you, Joe, remember we had GSK, which, was in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania.
I've been
like it. We got it transferred to Massachusetts, and that was a $3 billion settlement.
I had 2 cases in that settlement. I had the second to file and the 7th to file. And people don't that was sometimes when these cases settle, a company like GSK in this case will settle 8 or 10 false claims lawsuits at the same time. And then there's this big battle for who gets paid how much. And that's the real, Bobby, if I had to say that my expertise is at 2 things, there's 2 stages, right? The very beginning of creating a false claims case, getting the information and getting it filed. And at the end, fighting to get your fair share. All the stuff in the middle, the filing of the complaints, the writing of the complaints, the appearance with the judges and all that, I never got involved in that. I use guys like you. Well, you do what you're good at, right? And what I'm good at is dealing now. It's like I get all these doctors like my age, and they're fed up with the system, and they're walking in, turning in all these Medicare Part C companies and these big drug companies, and they're saying, I'm not going to do what they want me to do. And then I turn it over to guys like you, and now I co-counsel. Now I can co-counsel.
Right, yeah.
Right. And Stone and Magnanini, I've been working with Stone and Magnanini for how many years have we worked together?
Well, I think, like I said, I think you started with Dave.
Before it was Stone and Magnanini. Yeah. So when was Stone and Magnanini founded? Your partner is David Stone, and we're going to be interviewing David too. David's an interesting guy too in his own right. He's got his own you've got the military life. Dave is a producer.
Right?
Yeah. He produces movies, plays. Yeah, he was general counsel for the New York Yankees for a while.
The Yankee Nets, right? And so with Steinbrenner and Ray Chambers, he's got funny stories from that.
Yeah. So tell me, so you're Stone and Magnanini. You're based in New Jersey. You do cases all over the federal, all the jurisdictions from Hawaii to wherever.
Yeah, we've done from Massachusetts out to California. We got one in Washington State, Florida, Virginia.
Can you tell me, let's talk about a case that you've settled. It doesn't even have to be a false claims case, but what recent cases that you can talk about? Because we can't talk about everything, right? We can't talk about active cases.
Right. One of the things with the false claims act,
Deal
the case is under
settlements.
seal, right? And so if you disclose it and talk about it, we tell people don't, even talk to your spouse, because if it ever gets out, the government can come to you and say, well, thanks for all the information, thanks for all the work, thanks for all the help, but you breached the seal and you get nothing.
I had this guy come to me, Bobby, and it was years ago, and I think he worked for Pfizer, and he was really high up, and he had this case, and he called me up, and he wanted to do an interview. It was under seal, and he wanted to do an interview at 60 Minutes. And I said, if you do an interview at 60 Minutes, you're going to violate the seal, and you're going to piss off the DOJ. Get them angry. I'm sorry, my language. Just be careful. You're going to get the DOJ upset. And I said, you can have the money or you can have the fame, but you can't have both.
Right.
He does.
Token will get you on the subway.
Not only does he do the 60 Minutes interview, not only does he do the interview, he badmouths the Department of Justice, saying that they're not doing their job and they should be doing more. Well, of course, they just declined the case like the next day or something. And that was it. His case was over. And it was a shame because it was famous for a while back. It was in the press and all that. But, you've got to let the government do their job. And they do not like it when you get ahead of them in the press, right?
Exactly. I tell people, once we just settled the case yesterday, and part of the settlement involved, there's a settlement of the False Claims Act case. If the whistleblower was retaliated against, there's a way for you to bring a retaliation claim against the company as well. That they sometimes want to settle. And then there's a statutory provision that makes the defendants, not the whistleblower, pay the money the lawyers spend for experts. Some of these cases we spend $1 million, $2 million in hard costs and, $5 million in fees, because they fight you every step of the way. And the defendants hire all the very big, expensive, New York, DC law firms. They put 75-page white papers together. They give that to the government and say, this is a white paper. It's an even review of this case. You need to look at it and respond. And of course, the government looks at it and says, here you go, Bob. Can you research this and respond to it? So we've got to respond. They file motions to dismiss your case, even if it's not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, I was part of a Medco case, and I heard that they were paying the defendant companies were paying $3 million a month in legal fees.
Right. And we've had one where we settled. It settled for $48 million back in 2019, but I understood that the defendants had paid about $15 million in legal fees, and then they were fighting us because I think our statutory fees were like $1 million for a case that.
Yeah, we should explain that to people. In the False Claims Act, under the False Claims Act, the lawyers, there's two buckets of money. One, the government has a claim, and they will settle it and then issue a reward to the whistleblower, which is usually between 15 and 25%.
Right.
And it's usually closer to 18 to 20 is where we settle them, or 20%.
So, yeah, there's a lot of negotiation about that.
But then separately, the lawyers like Bob, or now actually myself, it's funny, I've only been a lawyer 5 years, so I'm getting used to it. The lawyers can get paid for their hours separately, so that doesn't come out of the whistleblower's pocket. All of that is paid by the defendants. Now, in addition, this is what I want to mention. In addition, many whistleblowers come to us. They got fired. They either got fired, or the situation at the company was so untenable that they have to quit. And that's called a constructive termination, right? Meaning, even though you quit, it's still like being fired under the law because you were pushed out because you blew the whistle. And I have cases where people write an email and they say, hey, I want to fix this. This is terrible. Patients are getting hurt, right? I do a lot of healthcare cases. And literally the next day they get fired, and that's how big companies operate. So if you're a person who blows the whistle on your company and then you get fired, or the company just makes you want to do things that are unconscionable to you and you quit, we can file what we call an H claim. And Bobby, why do they call them H claims? Because it's subsection H, right? Of the law.
Right. So when they wrote the law, they said if you file it starts off and there's subsection A, if you file a false claim. And then subsection B says if you use documents to submit a false claim, you can be sued for that. Subsection C says if you conspire to file a false claim, you can be sued for that. And there's these three provisions, D, E, and F, nobody ever really uses. They're all kind of small, bizarre things. And then subsection G says if you've robbed the government or committed fraud on the government and you've knowingly withheld funds, you need to return it. And if you don't return it, that's a reverse false claim, they call it. That's subsection G.
Right.
And
but the H claim is the section that allows whistleblowers to get paid separately for the damages for being retaliated against and losing their jobs. And I'm going to explain something here because it's important. I had a case, and I have a lot of H claim settlements that I get involved in. And this is what they don't teach you in law school. And I got to tell you, most false claims lawyers don't even do this, Bob. I mean, I've had arguments. There was a lawyer, I love him, and, he was a clerk to a Supreme Court justice and the whole bit, smart group, smart law firm. I don't want to say who they were. But I wanted to file an H claim with the false claim. And they said, no, we don't do those. And they had no clue. And I said, here's the key. If you have a big settlement, and this is what people don't understand, a big false claim settlement, and you have an H claim filed, which is an employment claim. If you take that same employment claim and you file it in state court, let's say you're in New York State, and you file that claim in state court, and you're a salesman for a drug company, and you make $110,000, $120,000 a year, your claim in state court isn't worth much. If they fired you and got rid of you, a regular employment claim, you're lucky if you get $100,000, if you get a year's pay. Now, that's considered a good settlement, right? $120,000, and you're going to pay legal fees, and you got to pay out of pocket for those fees. Under the False Claims Act, you have leverage over the settlement. So people don't understand this, and a lot of lawyers don't understand this, that if you have a $100 million false claim settlement, the company's looking at settling two claims. And a lot of the claims we do, Bobby, right, they're 200, 300 million, these big claims. So let's say a $200 million settlement against some drug company or something. There's going to be a whistleblower share of that 200 million. Let's say it's 20%, right? So now you've got a $40 million share. About right, 10%, $40 million. Now the client's getting $40 million, and make it smaller. I'm sorry. Let's say it's a $10 million settlement, and the client's share is $2 million. Right. And after paying attorneys, let's say it's a 40% attorney fee. So,
the usual, right? So that's $800,000. So you got $1.2 million for the client.
Right. The client gets $1.2 million, but the client wants more money than that. So say the client wants an extra $1 million. In order for the defendant, because the client has to sign off on the settlement, it's the United States plus the client against the bad guy, right? So the client has leverage over the settlement. So what we say is, okay, my client needs to make an extra $1 million. Now, if the company wants to pay my client $1 million, he has to pay $5 million more to the government, so 20% of that $1 million goes to my client. Or they can just pay directly to the H claim, and the government doesn't share in that.
Right. All of that, that's what we tell people. We said it gives you a different bucket, and with a lot of...
And it gives you leverage. Right. So we have taken clients who make $120,000 a year and gotten H claim settlements of $1 million, $2 million that they would never have gotten in state court.
Right. Because New Jersey has a SEPA law, the Conscientious Employee Protection Act, and those cases settle for much less. But the
key to an H claim is that the relator, the whistleblower, they call them a relator, has leverage over the settlement. So if you have this $100 million settlement, and it wants to settle, if the relator doesn't sign off on it, the government has to go to the judge, and there's a whole thing in front of the judge.
A FAR hearing, they call it, a fair, adequate, and
Right.
reasonable. Is the settlement fair, adequate, and reasonable?
Right.
And
And
the government, right, has to get the relator to sign off on it usually after the False Claims Act settlement is done, and then they turn the case over to us and say, okay, if there's a retaliation claim, settle it. And when you look at the False Claims Act, the wording of the statute, it says that the client's entitled to 2 times their pay, and then we usually have to subtract money they've earned, from that, but they get 2 times the pay from when they were terminated to the current time.
yeah, but
And
I've gotten settlements. I've gotten settlements for guys 20 times their pay. In other
well,
words,
that's right. But yeah, so the statute
because
too.
any money that the defendant pays to the government, that 20% of that money goes to the whistleblower, but any money they pay directly to the whistleblower, that goes to the whistleblower
Right,
dollar for dollar.
all to them. And and a lot of the whistleblowers are, as I said, unfortunately, Joe, as we were saying before, people don't read books. And there was a little Italian fellow from, Florence, who wrote a book, Machiavelli, and he said, you keep your friends close and your whistleblowers closer, is what I tell when I give seminars to defense lawyers or to, compliance people or boards of directors of healthcare companies, which I've done recently. And I'm doing a seminar next week for the New Jersey State Bar Association, the annual meeting down in Atlantic City. And I'm the lone plaintiff, so I'm the guy on our side of the V. And so when I talk to people, though, I say, you want to look at this, you need to settle the false claim, the fraud on the government. And I said, and most companies, as you said, when you get an email or something like that, instead of keeping the whistleblower closer, they'll retaliate. We had a guy at a pharma company who was a senior VP, been there for years, and he was complaining about this. He said, we're going to get in trouble. They're catching on. We need to do things. And they actually demoted him. They kept his title the same, but they moved him from the C-suite into a closet next to the boilers. They had to empty out a bunch of brooms and mop buckets, and they put his desk sideways because it wouldn't fit in his broom closet. And so they did that until he finally left. And I said, you've been constructively discharged. And of course, his whole life was invested in this company, and he lost his friends, he lost his stature. So there's all sorts of psychological tolls that takes whistleblowers suffer.
No, I've seen terrible things.
Yeah,
It's
people,
hard.
they get blackballed, they can't get jobs, they're living in a cardboard box under the East River bridges. There's all sorts of things. They're why they get divorced because of
Yeah, but on an age claim, Bobby, on an age claim, I mean, there's one now that I see where somebody was making, I don't want to use the real numbers, but let's say they were making $600,000 a year, but now because of what the company did to them, they can only make $400,000 a year. And I have a case just like this right now. And the damages to that person is the difference, the $200,000 a year, and they have like 25 years left of earning capacity. So you've got a $5 million case, plus it's actually more than that. So you can hire an expert and say what the lost earnings were. But under the age claim, I want people to understand, when you file an age claim, it's filed under federal seal. I think we should talk about the seal, Bob. It's a lawsuit that you file. The United States, you find a company, and let's say it's a drug company, and they're bribing doctors, or they're off-label marketing the drug, or they're violating whatever law they violate. And you blow the whistle internally, you get fired, whether you're directly fired or they make your life so miserable you have to quit. You go to a lawyer like Bob and you tell the story. We file a false claims lawsuit, and it says the United States of America, ex rel, and that stands for the relator, the person who tells the story, you. So it's United States of America, ex rel, relator versus, Pfizer, Sanofi, any one of these companies. But then if you got fired, in addition, we add a lawsuit just for you. And that's you versus the bad guy, you versus Pfizer, you versus whoever. And it's all filed under seal. And Bobby, you want to explain what a seal means? They say in Latin, in camera, right? That's the Latin term. But what does that mean in the real world?
Did it, Joe, was, again, this goes back to the Lincoln law, was back then the government was a lot smaller. So they gave you 60 days to investigate it. And they said no one should know about it except the government and, the person who bought it and the judge. And so the case is quiet. And you look on the docket now called PACER. And if you were to look up a case that's under seal, it just says the number. There's no name, no anything. And when we file the cases, the first page is actually under seal, XREL under seal versus under seal. And then the second page actually is the name parties. And what it is it allows the government to investigate. And they, like I said, it's supposed to be 60 days. Normally what happens is they want to get the relator in to have a relator's meeting and have the relator relay.
Nothing happened for 60 days in the federal government.
Right. Yeah, that's what I got. Back in 1863, maybe it did. And I mean, that wasn't the shoddy case wasn't hard, right? You have a bunch of naked Union soldiers out in the field.
Yeah, but the point of it is that the entire process is a secret and it's under seal. So if you work for a big company and you come to lawyers like Bob and his partner, David Stone, and you tell them the story and they file a lawsuit, your name doesn't come out until the very end of the case when the government has settled the suit. Now, what is that? That could be 3-4 years. So I have clients, and you do too, who have been under seal. See, they're worried that I want to go get another job. So they go to another company, but they're worried that if it comes out that they blew the whistle on the first company, that they would lose their job at the second company or get mistreated. And just the first thing I want to tell people is that, these cases, your name stays sealed until the government unseals it. And usually the government unseals the case. The government can decline your case or intervene on your case, but it takes them years to make that decision sometimes. So your name remains under seal. If they intervene on the case, it continues to remain under seal until they've done the full investigation and they're ready to either go to trial or settle the case. And then at one point, your name comes out. But usually your name comes out at the end when there's a settlement. And that's when it happens.
A press release usually.
Now, talk about a decline case for a second, Bobby. If the case gets declined, that means the government is not saying it's not a meritorious case. It's saying they're not going to proceed.
They don't have the resources. They're looking at other cases, et cetera.
Case get unsealed, Bob, when it's declined.
It does.
Like if you want to go forward, If your law firm decides to move forward without the benefit of the government, you have that right. And under the law, you get paid a mandatory amount of 30% if you win.
30%, right? So they give you an extra 5%, but you do all the work. And of course,
but at that point, the client's name comes out, correct?
Right, because the government will file a declination order, and the court then says we're going to unseal the whatever the operative complaint is, whether it was the first complaint or if it's been amended or changed somehow. That complaint and this order saying the case is declined, it's now unsealed, and it becomes a regular litigation. We have to serve people within 90 days. The lawyers, they get hire lawyers. They ask us for an extension. They generally file a motion to dismiss your case saying if everything they say is true, there's no legal basis to proceed. You fight about that. A lot of courts are now saying while the motions to dismiss are pending, which take 6-8 months, a year to decide sometimes, that discovery will begin. So we begin asking written questions. We ask for data. We ask for documents.
Yeah, I have a case. I have a friend of mine. I just had dinner with him this week. He runs a company, which is a laboratory that tests the quality and the makeup of pharmaceutical drugs. and he was responsible for a case against the company GlaxoSmithKline. And there was two cases that was created. He founded the drug called Zantac, and I'll probably interview him on the show. Yeah, he's a smart guy. But they basically that the drug Zantac contained nitrosamines in it, which is a product that if nitrosamines are in your drug, they get pulled off the market because there's a certain amount allowed and beyond that, and it causes cancer in rats. So if you want to cause cancer in rats, you give them nitrosamine. In his case, there was one case of mass tort, and we won't talk about that now, but there was a false claims case, and the government declined the case. They said, we don't want to proceed with the case. His lawyers took the case anyway, proceeded, and they got a $70 million settlement, of which the whistleblower gets $21 million. And that case literally got paid this week. So the government declined the case. The whistleblower took the case with his law firms anyway, without the help of the government, and was able to get a settlement of $70 million, of which $21 million is being paid to the whistleblower. And now the government, you think about that. First off, if the government had taken the case, they probably would have gotten a lot more money.
More money, right? They can debar you, so you never get to deal with the government again.
But here, if the government had taken that case and the government had gotten that $70 million settlement, he would have probably been paid 20%. So the government ended up paying an extra, they paid an extra $7 million that they wouldn't have had to pay had they taken the case. So I just want to get the message that if the government declines your case and you don't mind your name being out there, in this case, he didn't mind, there are a lot of meritorious cases that settle for a lot of money. That case for $70 million against GSK was declined initially by the government. And it's a righteous case. We call it a righteous case. And the mass tort settlement was $2.2 billion. Which that client gets no part of, because whistleblowers can get paid on whistleblower false claims cases. They cannot get paid on the mass tort case. And sometimes the mass tort case, my first case with you guys, my first big case was a case that settled for $1.2 billion, right? What was the Risperdal case?
Well, yeah, Risperdal was 2.2, Joe, against...
right, but my case wasn't. The false claims case wasn't, right?
Yeah, right. And that's, and the reason these quitams started, it was originated in England because they needed individuals to do what the government couldn't. So they said, interesting historical fact, the first Congress after the Constitution was passed, it contained 45 people who either signed the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution itself. And they had 10 different quitam laws in that Congress. So they said, there's talk now saying the quitam statutes are unconstitutional because you're becoming like an agent of the government and an officer of the government. And I said, it's crazy because I was a commissioned officer of the United States government. When I was a captain in the Army in Panama, I signed contracts that bound the United States government to pay for labor, ammunition, food, whatever I needed. And that's what I could do as an officer of the government. As a quitam lawyer, I can't do anything like that, right? It's like I can bring a case, I can right a wrong, I can help prevent people from getting injured or sick. We can get money recovered for the government, and from that they give you a reward. But so, today's world, you're not sure. We were wondering if the Department of Justice would withdraw from, the Zavaroff case, it's called, down in the Middle District of Florida, where the judge said, I find the quitam's statutes unconstitutional. And I said, it's strange, the first Congress with all these people who created the government, created the Constitution, got us free from England. They use this as a regular, program to get things done when the government didn't have the wherewithal to do it, and they just don't have, eyes everywhere, and so they need people out there in these different industries, healthcare, defense, looking over people's shoulders. And like I said, the companies, if they kept the whistleblowers in house and resolved the issues, companies could self-report, right, Joe? And they could then tell the government, and the government takes all of that into account, and a lot less is usually paid.
Very few companies self-report.
Right. Well, that's what they if we
That's not what
just
they do.
maybe we'll not get caught, or maybe we'll do this. And we had a case years ago of a health and dentist, the dentistry school in New Jersey, and they were billing the residents as doctors, and they told the board about it, and they kind of shrugged and said, well, let's see how long it takes them to catch on. And the end result was the board all got fired, the school got kind of disbanded, lost its individual status, and it's now part of Rutgers University, and then it had to pay a bunch of money back to the federal government and to the state government and to the whistleblower and to the whistleblowers lawyers. And so in the short run, it may have been a good idea, but in the long run, it surely wasn't.
Yeah, well, the whole concept of the False Claims Act is to get companies to it keeps companies in line. A lot of it's in healthcare. When you get these healthcare companies breaking the law, there's a lot of the cases that the cases that I'm attracted to are the cases where patients are being hurt. Somebody's they're surgeons who are doing surgery and then hurting people and billing the government for the cases. There are cases out there where a company was doing monitoring during surgery, and the person doing the monitoring is supposed to be a medical doctor for neurological monitoring they're operating on a spine. And instead of having an MD in the room, they were allowed to have a technician. But then what the company does is the person in the room doing the surgery, you're doing a spinal surgery. When you're operating on the spine, there's supposed to be an MD in the room monitoring with the nerve path conductions, right? So he's got this little machine, right? And he's supposed to monitor and send signals back and forth to the spine. So when the surgeons are operating, they know whether or not they're hurting the spinal cord.
They're cutting a nerve or something, yeah.
And in this case, this was a malpractice case that we did in law school. But and what happened was the guy who was in the room, who was supposed to be monitoring the spinal cord electronically, was actually a tech who had no training, and he was supposed to be supervised by another technician, and they were doing 3 or 4 of these surgeries at once. And the supervising guy wasn't in the hospital. He was doing it electronically and remotely. He was remotely overseeing. But it turns out that he wasn't even there. And then this young man had surgery, and the spinal cord was damaged for about an hour and a half. The spinal cord was showing no signs of activity. And they never told the surgeons, and the person woke up and he had no use of his legs. He'll be in the wheelchair for the rest of his life. And the guy was like a 30-year-old guy who had surgery. It was a big hospital in New York. And they sued for malpractice. But it could have been a great whistleblower case because all the surgeries at this hospital were being done the same way.
Right.
Yeah.
And
and I see this
in the government as if they're providing the service.
Yeah. And you see it over and again. You see it in anesthesia billing. You see it there. Spinal cord surgeries. You see it there. Dialysis centers. I mean, look how many cases DaVita has settled in Fresenius. Many, many cases. These companies have settled. DaVita just resolved a kickback case. I'm looking at an article here, July of 2024, to pay $34 million. I mean, unbelievable. Some of these companies, then they paid $350 million. And that was another false claim settlement. And that was back in 2014. If you type in DaVita and false claims settlements. It's just your computer will fill up with the cases that they settle.
That's what I said. It's part of what you're trying to do, on our side of the V is to kind of modify behavior. It's part of like, it's a necessary free market thing. When you deal
Yeah,
with
but
government agencies, there's what they call agency capture, where the people go to work for the companies and then they come back to the government. And so if you talk to different, people in Congress, they'll tell you, you know, the agencies can only do so much because part of them are beholden to the people they're regulating. And they'll go, and we see this in a lot of the military cases where people leave the military and doing what, their job there, and they retire, and the next day they're back on the job, but with a suit and tie, and they're working for the entity that they were responsible for overseeing. And the entity may have been committing fraud for years, but of course, if you're going to go work for them and double your salary, are you gonna blow the whistle and throw them under the bus?
well, that's the problem. We're always punching uphill. We're always punching up, right? There's always the person we're dealing with, at least in the cases that you and I do. We do the drug company cases and we do all those big cases, and they have so much money and so much power and influence. Even over the Department of, you hope that the Department of Justice, how do you say this? The DOJ only has so many resources, right? They only have so many people, so much money. And then you're going against these giant drug companies that can spend $2-3 million a month to defend themselves. And
a lot of lawyers at a lot of law firms. And then
like
the judges. The judge is the ultimate referee, but the guy's got, in federal court in New Jersey, they have 380 something cases. If you worked on each case one day a year and you never took a day off, you wouldn't get to all the cases you were assigned. So, when you have to go to the judge, it takes time. Things get, delayed. And as you said, Joe, while the government is doing the case, it's under seal. But once it gets unsealed, it's out in public. And of course,
and your firm does litigate a lot. I mean, you guys are litigators too.
Right. So we do intellectual property work. We do breach of contract. And we're used to going in and fighting for people. They come to us and we'll file the case in state court or federal court. We'll, defend the motions. We do defense work for certain people too. So we've been sued, and then we try and get rid of the case either, as economically as possible.
So you went to Columbia Law School,
right?
And Dave Stone, your partner, went to Harvard Law School,
right. So
which I hear about
yeah. And it's
every time somebody's a Harvard graduate, it's like within the first 5 minutes of conversation, not even the first minute and a half of conversation, they have to throw that name out there. Yeah. He went to Harvard Law School.
Double. He was a Harvard law guy. And
Dave is a whole different animal. His father was a well-known professor.
Yeah, very, very long tenured professor at Harvard.
May his memory be a blessing, as they say, the Jews say. And I'm a Messianic Jew, so But his father was
a doctor too, Joe. He was
a psychiatrist. Yeah, his father was an MD, JD, just like me, and his father taught at Harvard Law School, a well-known professor. I think he was a psychiatrist, right? And he taught forensics or.
He also taught
competency. He was a competency expert.
Yeah, like copyright, playwright, and different things like this. So he's very funny. He was saying to my wife and I one time, he goes, these students, he goes, they're very intelligent, very, but he goes, a lot of people are not self-aware. And he said, so they come to me and they've gotten like a C in my class, and they're like, would you read my movie script? I need a good recommendation, or will you write me this letter of recommendation? And he's like, did you not remember? You didn't.
Wait, you talking about Dave's dad or Dave?
This was David's dad. Yeah, his father was telling.
I didn't know his father had anything to do with movie scripts.
Oh yeah, his father was. He would go, as part of his job was he would go to London and the West End and see plays and do things. So he taught different classes related to movies and production, or not
Harvard,
but at Harvard Law. Yeah.
Wow. So that's why Dave got involved in theater.
Dave had it as kind of in the DNA growing up. But
Yeah.
his dad, was saying these people come to him and, they didn't do well, and they want the letter of recommendation. They want, this commentary on, on this and the other thing. And he's like, if you'd come and you had done a lot of work and you impressed me and I gave you an A, he goes, that's one thing. But
Yeah, I think I'm at the next episode. I want to talk to Dave Stone, because it's Stone and Magnanini.
Yeah.
And everybody brings an interesting background to the table. And all of us have been involved in this, fighting these whistleblower cases. I've been doing it 30 years. You've been doing it about as long, right? 20.
About 20. And David was doing them back in the 90s, I think.
Yeah, well, that's actually when I did the Risperdal case, I was one of the whistleblowers. It was originally a Boies Schiller case.
Yeah, because I thought we picked it up from you in 2004, and that one is the one the Jansen we resolved in 13, Joe, right? It took 9.
Yeah, with Jansen Risperdal. Yeah, it's been a long time.
I think in 2000. So that was a 13-year case, and then the GSK, the larger settlement, was a 12-year case. It took till July.
I've had so many, Bobby. I get confused myself. You know what I do sometimes.
There's so many out there. In a certain.
I either look. I have to do a Google search with my name in the case, or I look on the wall behind me. I've got all of the settlements framed in these beautiful blue settlements. And it's GSK, it's Medco, and I get confused because sometimes I go back to the same company twice. I think I've been involved, I've been involved in so many settlements. But you guys are good. I mean, you're a good firm. You handle all kinds of cases, not just false claims cases. And you both have an interesting background. I mean, this military intelligence, I just think it's fascinating that you did that, and then Columbia Law School, and then
we didn't even get into my time at the Pentagon, Joe, when I was working for the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Army, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. That'll be another podcast. We'll talk some more cases, but I know we live the cases, so they're part of our breathing, and you deal with this. You're up at night. It's like, and you're like, crap, we should do this. Write this down. I got to call people in the morning. You do this, you do that, and so.
It's funny, but when you're in a whistleblower business, whistleblowers, they have to deal with a lot of issues, stress. They're usually strapped for money because they're fired, and or they've been slandered by the people who fired them. They blow the whistle, and immediately the company comes after them. And we've seen it over and over again. I've seen
rogue employees is one of the great, as the usual lines. If you're complaining about it, you must have done it, and you must. And of course, we
had a case with a big drug company with a doctor who was a researcher, and then he told him, he said, "Listen, it's a great drug, but for 30% of Americans, it doesn't work." I don't want to name the case, but there were internal emails immediately. Trying to say, what do we do now to discredit this doctor, who, by the way, was their lead researcher for 10 years. And, he's some famous guy at some famous institution. But because he dared come out and say, the drug doesn't work in a certain percentage of people for a specific reason, then the emails start flying back and forth about how we have to discredit and ruin this guy. I see stuff like that. It makes my stomach turn. I get angry. I've done all the cases, Bobby, that I've been involved in because I just get pissed off, and
that's what I said. And there's not a lot of law that you get to bring the moral righteousness, but these cases you do. Like I said, a lot of the commercial disputes we have, people are fighting about money, and you could pay us a ton of money. They can pay their lawyers a ton of money, or we can come to something that's economically reasonable.
I think you guys represented me on the Medco case. Was it the Medco case?
Down in Philadelphia, exactly.
And how I started, and the way I started that case, that was a $155 million settlement back in 2006. And that's when I got into this business full time. But how I started that case, Bob, I come home, my mother's crying, and I wasn't living with my mother. I went to visit my mom, and she's at the kitchen table crying. I said, "What happened?" And she said, "The doctor switched my medication to this medication, and I don't like it. It doesn't work." But he said I had to change. And then I said, "Let me see your card." And it had the name of a company called Medco on it. And I'm like, what the hell is this? This is like, it's a PBM. It was the first, I didn't know what a PBM was.
Yeah.
But it turned out they had
managers.
Pharmacy benefit manager. Yeah. And they had
the richest companies in America. Some of the richest.
Yeah. Well, they had, this was a company called Medco, and they switched. It was Medco was started by the guy who also then went on to found WebMD, and he sold the company to Merck. So I'm not blasting anybody, but Merck Medco, it was a drug company that owned a pharmacy benefit manager, which was supposed to be the gatekeeper. So it's like when Merck bought Medco, it was like the fox buying the hen house, and then he just then all of a sudden everybody started getting switched to Merck drugs. So there was a $155 million false claim settlement for Medco Health Solutions. But it turned out that my mom's drugs were switched, and it turned out that Medco was calling all of these pharmacists, had like a call center, getting them to switch drugs, so that everything became, now all of a sudden my mother was on a Merck drug or some drug that Medco benefited from.
Right.
And that's how I got involved in that case. I didn't know a thing about PBMs. I just went home to visit my mom one day, and she's in tears crying about this particular case. A lot of my cases started like that, where, it was some real harm to somebody, and I just got angry. And I'm like Italian, right? So when you get angry I'm one of those guys that, you get hooked on something, you never let go. What are those? What's that dog that bites you and never lets go?
Yeah, a terrier.
A pit bull. They bite you, they never let go. You got to kill this freaking dog to get him to stop. And that's what happens. That's a lot of the cases that I did, and you guys were my lawyers from the beginning. And then I became a lawyer, and then that kind of,
Now you got both sides of it, Joe. That's what I said.
Well, yeah, now you can get paid on all. It was the natural thing for me, Bob. I started law school. I went to Fordham Law School too, right after med school. But then I had to drop out, take care of my mom. And so 30 years went by, and I never went back to law school. And then I finally said, you know what? I'm going to do it. And I went back. And I went back at the age of 60, full time. And then became a lawyer like 5 years ago. And now I have both. But it was a good career. And you guys were there with me the whole way, And now we work on cases together, which is kind of cool. Instead of being the client, now I'm your co-counsel. And that's kind of great. We can co-counsel cases together. And it was a good journey for me. I say journey. I have to say journey in every podcast because that's the word. Okay. Journey is you have to get.
Yeah, your travel.
If you say journey, that shows that you're relevant and you're hip and you're relevant. We're all on journeys, Bobby. I'm on a journey.
That's the important thing.
I want to thank you. It's been informative, and you guys are in New Jersey, Stone and Magnanini, and all they can do is Google. They're not going to Google Magnanini. They're probably going to Google Dave Stone and David Stone false claims. You'll get the right one. There's actually two David Stones, believe it or not.
Right. There's the producer of Wicked. Yeah.
Well, there's a David Stone that's a big producer on Broadway.
Right. He produced Wicked originally.
You're David Stone, who's also a producer on Broadway, but he's like the other David Stone.
One. Yeah. That's
the other one did Wicked. The first David Stone, I think he did Wicked.
Right.
So
David said, he goes, when I would go out and say, "Oh, I'm David S. Stone," people's eyes would go, "Wow!" And then he would have to actually say the other.
I really, which is funny because your David Stone is a lawyer, Harvard guy, and also has produced theater, film. I mean, he's done a lot. David, your partner.
Yeah, he's at Off Broadway. He's on.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to get him next, but you guys are good. You guys, I've worked with a lot of law. I've probably worked with 20 law firms as a whistleblower, and you guys are great. You're just good people, tenacious, and if people out there want to bring a false claims case, they can call either one of us because we'll end up working together anyway.
Yeah, like I said, we just want to win, and we
just want to win. And
defense of the client was the only thing I learned in law school. So
yeah, and if the government intervenes on a case, great. And if they don't intervene on a case, it doesn't mean the case is not a good case. It doesn't mean it's not a righteous case. The government passes on cases a lot of times because it's not a right fit. You know, there's a lot of politics, even in the Department of Justice, and resources, and and quite frankly, the government will more likely to intervene on a case if the law firm is a good law firm. If the law firm's not as intense a law firm, the cases that they file tend not to. I just read a complaint recently from a case that was declined, and I have information on the same company. And I looked at the case that was filed because it was declined, and I read the complaint. And I got to tell you, Bobby, it's a complaint you never would have filed. I never would have filed it. It just didn't have enough information in it. But it turns out that, right, it was one allegation. Now I have a guy comes to me and he's got like 4 more allegations about the company that are much better, much stronger. But the government declined a case against this company. Bad cases don't help us, right? I mean, like when people file, bad cases make bad law. But I just want the message to get out there that if you have information and you want to file a case, if you're working for the company, it's really important to find the law firm that has won. And the real simple way to pick firms is just look at their settlements. If they're like a law firm that doesn't really handle false claims cases and hasn't had a bunch of big settlements, they're probably not resourced properly. But if you look at a firm like Stone and Magnanini and look at their settlements, or go to my website, both of us, we've settled major cases, and we've been doing it for 20 years.
Yeah, across the spectrum too.
Yeah, and the biggest slam against me was that I wasn't a lawyer, so it was hard for people to get their head around the fact that I was settling case after case after case, and I wasn't a lawyer. I remember once this lawyer from a great law firm, is a firm called Phillips and Cohn, and they're a great law firm. John Phillips and Mary Louise Cohn are great people, and they really were the first lawyers into the false claims space, right?
John had revised it under Reagan and really kind of
and John Phillips is a great guy. John Phillips became the ambassador to Italy.
That was a good
great, but great people. But one day I'm sitting in Philadelphia, Eastern District of Philadelphia, and we're at a relators settlement meeting, which means the relators who are getting paid are going to come in and settle, because who's going to get what share? It's like a big pie, right? And everybody wants a piece of this pie. And the lawyer for Phillips and Cohn was there, and he just says to me, he says, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm the only guy in the room. He says, Dr. Joe, you're becoming a bit of a cottage industry, aren't you? Because I had like 4 or 5 cases where they were the law firm, and I was fighting with them to get paid. And you guys were my lawyers on one of the cases.
Well, that's the
Amgen case.
Right. We did that huge mediation.
Oh my God! When Amgen settled, the newspaper. They were writing about those cases, right? And they were saying, so Dave and I, you're part of. I'm going to talk to Dave about Amgen we should talk with Dave, because that was some case, and there was all this press that I was this bad guy, but Amgen pled guilty to a crime. They had a criminal plea.
Oh, so
they ended.
Yeah, they had
that case ended up with a big settlement. Yeah,
that document, and Judge Sterling Johnson, I remember, said.
Yeah, I remember him. He knew my brother. But that's okay. I got to discuss that with Dave. Sterling Johnson.
Yeah, I'll shut up, Joe. You go to.
And he knew my brother. My brother was a prosecutor in the Bronx.
In the Bronx for years, the DA's office.
Yeah, and then this guy became a federal judge, and I remember that case. The Amgen. There was a lot of press about that case, and they tried to paint me as a bad guy, but they ended up paying $750 million or something to settle that case.
$612 million. Yeah, but I remember them going to court, and Judge Johnson saying them. This is an overzealous sales rep. And Judge Johnson says, well, this document shows how, medical practices can get a return on investment by using.
They paid $762 million, Bobby.
Oh, was that? I remember it being 600, and then it was
$762 million.
Oh, it might be. It was the misbranding charges. I think on the criminal side. Yeah, it was right. $150 million. And so,
and you know how I started that case. When I did the investigation on that case, and I had a list of all these doctors that had gotten paid money from Amgen, all of these oncologists.
Yeah, the
My father's doctor was on the list. My dad had cancer, and his oncologist was getting payments from Amgen. So you got to think to yourself, when they give out these drugs, and that's a classic example of a case where a company makes cancer drugs and they're bribing doctors to give patients more drugs. And that's just horrible to me. Yeah, all right. So I'm going to end things here. Thank you, Bobby, for coming on this. And really appreciate it. Look forward to working with you, and I look forward to doing lots of cases with you until we can't do this anymore.
Right. At some point, we end up on an island. So,
Bye-bye, Bobby. Thank you.
Take care, Joe. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.